Okay, so are you ready to dive into some serious history with us today? We're talking about Palestine, a place that's been like the ultimate historical crossroads.
It really has been, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's incredible when you think about it. This one relatively small region has been fought over and conquered for millennia.
I know, it's mind-boggling.
Yes.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive. We're unpacking a history of Palestine course to try to get a handle on how this place became, well, Palestine.
It's a big job, almost overwhelming.
Totally. We're definitely going to have our work cut out for us with this one. But hey, that's part of the fun, right?
Absolutely, and I think our listeners will get a lot out of it. So where should we even begin?
Well, I think it makes sense to start with the basics. Like, geographically speaking, what makes Palestine such a desirable and constantly contested piece of real estate?
That's a great place to start. I mean, look at a map. Palestine is literally a bridge between Africa, Asia, and Europe.
A land bridge.
Right. It's this narrow strip of land connecting these massive continents. So throughout history, it's been a crossroads for trade, for armies.
For ideas.
Exactly. And that's not even mentioning the climate.
Oh, right. The Mediterranean climate.
Yeah. Hot, dry summers, mild, wet winters.
Perfect for agriculture.
Exactly. And that's why you see early civilizations popping up in Palestine. I mean, think about Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world.
I know. It's amazing to think about how long people have been living and building in that region. And speaking of those early inhabitants, our course mentions the Canaanites, Philistines, and Israelites.
Ah, the usual suspects.
Right. But I have to admit, growing up, I always thought of them as just names in a history book, not real people with, their own distinct cultures and everything. What were they actually like?
Oh, they were definitely real, and they each had their own unique cultures and contributions. Let's start with the Canaanites. They get overlooked sometimes, but they were there first. And not just first, they were influential, like their language, their religious ideas. Those things had a huge impact on the whole region. It's similar to how Latin shaped so many languages even after the Roman Empire was long gone.
So the Canaanites were kind of like the trendsetters of their time.
Totally. And even though they eventually disappeared as a distinct group, their legacy lived on.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, you've got the Philistines.
Yes. The Philistines, they always seem to get cast as the villains, at least in, Sunday school.
Right. The bad guys.
Totally.
But they were so much more than just biblical bad guys. I mean, they were actually incredibly advanced for their time. Archaeologists are finding all sorts of evidence pointing to their sophisticated weaponry. Plus their pottery. Amazing.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It's so distinctive that archaeologists can tell if a piece is Philistine just by its style.
Wow, so they had their own unique artistic traditions, too.
They did. And we can't forget, they were a real force to be reckoned with militarily. Their presence actually played a big role in pushing the Israelites to form a more unified kingdom.
Which makes sense, if you've got a common enemy.
Right. Safety in numbers. And that's a key moment in the story of the Israelites. They go from these scattered tribes to a more centralized kingdom under kings like Saul, and then, of course, the most famous, King David.
With Jerusalem as their capital.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that move, making Jerusalem their capital, well, that had major implications for the region. Religiously, politically, even thousands of years later.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate the significance of Jerusalem in this whole story.
It's central, no pun intended.
Uh-huh.
But of course, like all kingdoms, it didn't last forever. They eventually split into Israel and Judah, and tragically, both kingdoms were conquered and their people scattered by empires, which sadly seems to be a bit of a recurring theme in this region's history.
It's true. It's almost like every empire in the ancient world took a turn trying to control Palestine.
Well, you're not wrong. Yeah, it really is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines. It's like a who's who of ancient empires.
It really is. And they didn't just pass through, they each left their own distinct mark on the region.
Totally. And some were definitely more forceful than others.
Like the Assyrians.
Yeah, they were infamous for their ruthlessness.
Oh.
I mean, remember the lost tribes of Israel. This wasn't just some random disappearance. The Assyrians were masters of forced relocation.
It's crazy to think they could just erase entire cultures like that.
It was a different time, for sure. But yeah, they scattered those tribes so effectively that to this day, nobody's 100% certain what became of them.
Wow, talk about an enduring mystery.
Definitely. And the Assyrians weren't the only ones who left a lasting impact. Don't forget about the Babylonian exile.
Oh, right. That was a pretty pivotal moment for the Jewish people, wasn't it?
Huge. I mean, up until that point, the idea of a Jewish diaspora communities living outside of their homeland didn't really exist.
But when the Babylonians conquered Judah,
Bam. They deported a significant chunk of the population to Babylon.
which forced those communities to find new ways to practice their faith, right?
Exactly. That's when we see the development of synagogues and a real emphasis on scripture and religious identity. It was about preserving their heritage in the face of incredible adversity.
It's amazing how often great hardship leads to cultural innovation.
It's true. Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. But, not all empires were quite so heavy-handed.
Really? Were any of them actually decent?
Relatively speaking, the Persians weren't too bad, at least compared to, say, the Assyrians. They were surprisingly tolerant when it came to religion.
You mean for an empire that had just conquered a whole bunch of people?
Yeah, they allowed those who'd been exiled to Babylon to return to Jerusalem. And get this, they even let them rebuild the temple.
Seriously. That's pretty unexpected.
Right. It was a huge deal. I mean, imagine the wave of emotion, the sense of hope that must have swept through those communities.
It must felt like a new beginning.
Absolutely. This wasn't just about rebuilding a temple. This was about reviving a culture and a faith that had been brutally suppressed.
Okay, so the Persians were surprisingly chill, but what about the Greeks?
The Greeks, well, they were a whole different story. They brought their own brand of influence to Palestine.
It was.
Let's just say they were big on spreading their culture.
Yeah.
And they were pretty good at it, too. Suddenly, Greek was everywhere, in the streets, in the marketplace.
The lingua franca.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't just the language. It was their ideas, their art, their architecture, even their philosophy. And remember, this is the time when the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, was translated into Greek.
He called it the Septuagint, right?
Bingo.
Wow. So the Bible I grew up with was actually a translation of a translation. That's pretty wild when you think about it.
It is, and it actually caused quite a stir back then. I mean, imagine this. You're a Jewish person living in Palestine. You've got your sacred texts, right? But now there's this new version of it, this Greek version, and it's spreading like wildfire.
It must have been pretty unnerving.
Oh, totally. It triggered all sorts of debates about how to balance their own traditions with these new Hellenistic influences. It's something people still struggle with today, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you hold on to your own culture while engaging with the wider world?
It's a constant balancing act. But before we get too philosophical, we have to talk about the Romans.
Oh, yes, the Romans.
Because their arrival marks a pretty major turning point in the story of Palestine, wouldn't you say?
Totally. I mean, you can't talk about this period without talking about the rise of Christianity.
It's true. This is when Christianity, which started as a small Jewish sect, really starts to take root and spread.
And of course, any discussion of the Romans and this region wouldn't be complete without mentioning the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD.
Right, because Jerusalem was still the center of Jewish life at this point, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was devastating. I mean, this wasn't just a building. It was the heart of their faith, their culture, their identity.
So what happened after the Roman?
Well, eventually the Roman Empire splits, and the eastern half, with its capital in Constantinople, becomes the Byzantine Empire.
And the Byzantines. They were basically Romans 2.0, right?
Pretty much. They inherited a lot of Roman laws and traditions, but under the Byzantines, Palestine underwent a pretty significant transformation. Remember all those pilgrims we talked about earlier?
The ones traveling to Jerusalem.
Exactly. Well, under Byzantine rule, Palestine basically became a Christian pilgrimage destination. They built churches and monasteries, and pilgrims from all over the empire flocked to see the holy sites.
It's kind of amazing how quickly the region went from being the heartland of Judaism to becoming a major pilgrimage site for this new religion. Talk about a historical plot twist. But you know what else is interesting?
What's that?
For all the upheaval, for all the empires that marched in and out, there's still this incredible sense of continuity in the story of Palestine. It's like every layer of history is still visible today.
That's what makes it such a fascinating place to study. But get ready for another twist, because just as the Byzantine Empire is starting to weaken, a new force is emerging from the Arabian Peninsula, a force that will reshape the political and religious landscape of Palestine and beyond.
You're talking about Islam, right?
You got it.
Okay, so we've got the Ottomans on the decline, and European powers, well, they're not exactly known for missing an opportunity. What happens next?
You know how the saying goes, when the cat's away?
The mice will play.
Exactly. And in this case, the mice were the European powers, and they were ready to carve up the Ottoman Empire for themselves. They weren't even being subtle about it.
So how'd they manage to exert so much influence? Weren't the Ottomans still technically in control?
Well, they had their ways. They used these things called capitulations, basically, treaties that gave them special economic and legal privileges within the Ottoman Empire.
Privileges, you mean like the special treatment?
Oh, totally. Like imagine a set of rules that only apply to you, but not to the locals. That was basically the deal. Europeans could trade freely by land. Heck, they could even avoid Ottoman taxes, all thanks to these capitulations.
No wonder the Ottomans were struggling.
Right. It created this system where they were economically and politically dominant, even though the Ottomans were, still calling the shots, at least on paper.
Talk about adding insult to injury.
It was a recipe for resentment, that's for sure. And then, to make matters even more complicated, you've got European missionaries pouring into Palestine.
Ah, yes, the missionaries, because sending in people to convert the locals is always a good idea when you're trying to maintain stability.
Well, it definitely didn't help. On the surface, they were there to spread Christianity, build schools and hospitals, good deeds and all that.
Right, but it was more than just spreading the gospel, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They were also spreading Western ideas about, well, everything. Education, culture, even government. They saw it as a civilizing mission.
I bet they did.
And, it's not so black and white. Some Palestinians actually welcomed these new ideas. They saw it as a path to modernization, a way to catch up with the rest of the world. But others felt like their own culture and traditions were under attack. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong.
So it was a period of immense change, immense pressure.
Absolutely. And all of this is happening while the Ottoman Empire is literally crumbling from within.
Not exactly a recipe for peace and harmony.
Not at all. And then, to make matters even worse, World War I breaks out.
Talk about a global game changer.
Right. I mean, World War I was a complete or utter disaster for the Ottoman Empire. They sided with the losing team, and when the dust settled, the empire was gone, kaput.
And I'm guessing the victors weren't interested in just dividing up the Ottoman territories fairly and equitably.
You're catching on. They had their own agendas, their own ideas about how the Middle East should be carved up.
Which brings us to the Sykes-Picot Agreement, right? That was the secret deal between Britain and France to
divide the spoils of war, basically. They drew these lines on a map with little to no regard for the people who actually lived there, might I add, and decided who got what.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is a perfect example of how the arrogance of empires can have devastating and long-lasting consequences.
And to make matters even worse and more complicated, there was also the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Ah, yes, the Balfour Declaration, a seemingly simple letter that had huge knee repercussions.
It was basically Britain saying, hey, we think it would be a great idea if you Zionists had a homeland in Palestine.
That's the gist of it, yeah. They were basically giving their blessing to the Zionist goal of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, even though there were already people living there.
Talk about a recipe for conflict.
It was. I mean, on the one hand, you have the Jewish people who had faced centuries of persecution, who saw this as a recognition of their right to a homeland. And on the other, you have the Palestinian Arabs, who were already living in Palestine, who saw this as their land being promised to another group.
It's almost impossible to imagine being in that situation.
It was a complete mess, and it put Britain, who is now responsible for administering Palestine, under a mandate from the League of Nations, in a really tough spot.
Tough spot is putting it mildly, I'd say. So how did they handle it?
Not well. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased. Tensions between Jews and Arabs escalated. There were riots, uprisings, acts of violence. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. And it did. In 1948, as Britain withdrew from Palestine, war broke out.
This is what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe.
Exactly. And it really was a catastrophe for the Palestinian people. Hundreds of thousands were forced to flee their homes, becoming refugees. Entire villages were destroyed. It was a traumatic and dispossessing experience.
And of course, this was just the beginning of the conflict, wasn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. The 1948 war was just the first in a long series of wars and uprisings that would come to define this region. The Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the Intifadas. It's a heartbreaking cycle of violence and mistrust that continues to this day.
It's hard to see a way out.
It is. But history also teaches us that even the most entrenched conflicts can be resolved. It takes dialogue, empathy, and a willingness to compromise from all sides.
It's a lot easier said than done.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
But you have to hold on to hope, right?
I think so, yeah. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Yes, I think that's a good place to stop.
To our listeners, we hope you found this journey through the history of Palestine as enlightening as it was, well, honestly, heartbreaking at times.
It's a complex and often tragic story, but it's one that's essential to understanding the world we live in today.
If you're interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out the course materials. We've just scratched the surface here, and there's so much more to explore.
And so many perspectives to consider.
Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep those deep dives going.